name is Zimiti Chodeva, and welcome to PwC's Boardroom Forum Live. Our series is focused on sustainability, what it means for Africa, and today specifically we'll be focusing on the topic of just transition, what it is, what it means in our local context, and more specifically for our communities in South Africa. Joining me today, I've got Chantal van der Walt, who is a director in PwC sustainability practice. Welcome, Chantal.
Thank you.
Good to have you. Chantal, maybe to kick us off today, if you can just let us know, what is just transition? What does it mean?
Great. So let me premise, there are a lot of nuances in terms of just transition. So a lot of what I'm presenting are my points of view. But I think I'll start it with, we're in a system of stress. So our economic system, which is nestled in our social and natural systems, is very much under stress. And small things will tip us into states that are suboptimal for businesses to run, for society to have a quality of life. So that's sort of the premise for just transition. If you look at the concept, it's not a new one. It was formed in the US in the 1980s, and it was really helping workers that were in industries that had environmentally hazardous jobs, and they were looking at how do they sunset those jobs. So the concept really has come from how do we then help workers, employees and value chains that are in those sunset or stressed industries. How do we help them move from what they're doing now into something that is going to be competitive, resilient, and future fit? And I think what I like about knowing that is that then just transition takes a bit of a different tack from just an energy transition. So we're not just talking about how do we technologically move from one energy system to another and how that impacts on what our society and economy needs, how some parts of and locations in South Africa are going to be affected. And it's not just about leaving no one behind, but it's actually about rethinking our whole economy. How do we make sure that our economy is future fit? How do we make sure that the quality of jobs, the energy mix, skills we have, all of those things make South Africa Inc. future fit. So that for me is how I would define just transition and sort of equate what has been born out of an environmental hazardous transition to, we call it an energy transition. I almost want to say it's an economic transition.
And why is it important for us here in South Africa?
I think because we have realized that we can't continue to run the way we do, to operate in terms of society, in terms of business. We can't do that in the way we've always done it. As I mentioned, our systems are under stress. And when that happens and they tip, there's some sort of change, be it an extreme weather event like we saw in KZN, with a lot of damage to our infrastructure, to our sectors like tourism, to things like water security, food security. All of those things tip into a disturbed state. We can't continue to operate the way we do. And we know that it's going to be more and more frequent, looking at the way the models and what they're telling us. So we've got to start thinking about how we are going to plan for food security, how we're going to feed everyone, how are we going to maintain our infrastructure, how are we going to think through health implications of all these changes we have around us. And that means natural changes, but also the social changes. Because as societies are stressed, we see the social cohesion breakdown. We see things like riots, and that all has a knock-on impact. So for me, I think South Africa, being the history we have, being where we are in this point in time, we want to be competitive globally. We don't want to concentrate risk. And at the moment, if we don't make lots of quite tough decisions, we might end up in a worse state than if we did.
No, and I think you raise a couple of very good points, I think particularly related to our South African context. Now, if we bring it down to call it our public sector specifically, right? Are we ready? how ready are we to actually drive just transition? I think we know that national government has a number of plans and the like, but how, is that translating into local government actions?
So I think so. And I know that's probably an optimistic view compared to what others might be saying. But I do think that we have got a lot of good foundations already. We've got some of the best law and regulation around, very well esteemed. It's about implementing that, but also thinking through like the new committees and forums that are forming, the Presidential Climate Committee, how businesses come together around the problem alongside government. It's not going to be easy, but I think the worthwhile things are never really easy, and that's going to be what sets us up. So that's more of a national feel. I think the tough stuff really happens at the local government. They are literally, and I use this pun maybe deliberately, maybe not, at the coalface. And they need to be able to recover from disasters, manage social fabric, deliver services, and there's a lot there. So in the private sector, we start talking about it from the point of view of a CEO dilemma. And our survey last year spoke about that, where CEOs of organizations have to think through the short-term crises, managing cash flows, keeping people's jobs viable, just keeping the business running. But they've also got to have their eye on that horizon and start thinking about, what does this mean for me in the long term? What might I not be seeing now or not able to do anything about now that's going to quickly be on my doorstep, and I'm going to suffer if I don't think now about that? So that dilemma of short-term to long-term is the thing that I think we need to manage when we think about it from a local government point of view. How do we help our governments, and how do we partner and work together to make sure that we don't only focus on short-term at the expense of some of those long-term problems? But I see some very positive movement around collaboration.
That's great. I mean, we'll be covering aspects around collaboration a little bit later. But for now, if we could sort of cast our mind to the Just Transition Framework for South Africa, which states that it was developed for all social partners in South Africa, right? Across all sectors. Now, taking into account the work done by PwC around bringing public and private sector collaboration, can this model support bringing partners together?
So Zimiti, I know you are probably very well positioned to answer that question, having been involved. But from what I've seen, there's been some extremely positive traction around this from the water perspective. Because the way you've set up the collaboration is that there's shared contribution, shared governance, and then you start to build trust around that. You start to see some progress, and it all starts to just generate that momentum. So I think, what's been demonstrated out of the water case studies, especially if you think about in a just transition discussion, different locations and different sectors and individuals are going to be impacted differently. So while just transition, in the way I speak about it, about economic transition, affects everybody in some way, there are going to be winners and losers in how this all plays out. So if you think about Mpumalanga, and you think about how the fossil fuel and the coal sector is so concentrated in certain cities in Mpumalanga, those people, those households, the value chains that are set up to service that area are going to need support in deliberately transitioning. And that's going to mean on the people side, technology side, processes. And so I think the water case study could be very well applied in a location like that.
Oh, most certainly, I think. And Mpumalanga is a classic example of where a lot of what you're speaking about actually should be coming into play. Right? So I think very relevant. Chantal, I'll ask you a question. And I think this one is, I'd hope will enlighten us in terms of why this is so important, right? Because really, what is the impact of doing nothing? Is that even an option?
So some people would, I think, prefer it, particularly those that obviously have set up and they have a lifestyle, they have a job in that sector perhaps. So I'm not speaking from that point of view. But the position that I can speak from is understanding the systems. Being an environmental scientist, understanding our systems under stress, the cost of doing nothing from my point of view is worse than the cost of being deliberate about what we do in those locations that are worst affected. Because we don't have then the benefit of doing something proactively. We are reacting to extreme weather events and flooding and heat waves and health strain and how that knocks into the health sector. Migration and people moving because they are no longer able to maybe subsist agriculturally in the one area. They've got to move to urban areas, the knock-on strain of that into urban areas. So there's just so many knock-on effects if we don't be deliberate and carefully walk the path of just transition for those fossil fuel intense sectors. If we don't do it, I feel like we are really sabotaging what South Africa Inc. can look like in the future. And then we've lost that FOST advantage, or that forward-looking advantage that we have now to be more deliberate about the change.
Thanks, Chantal, for your valuable insights on what I know is a really important topic, particularly for us here in South Africa. And to those of you who are joining us online, thanks for joining us. We do welcome you to join us in the next 2 weeks for our next session, which will be on climate adaptation, what it means for businesses across the rest of Africa. Thanks.